Then there's exposure to danger, and now this may not be something that is so apparent or relevant to us working in Australia, but it is, I'm going to tie it in because I think it's also a relevant thing to take into consideration. One of my colleagues, a very prominent trauma clinician in Israel, Eli Summer, that some of you may have heard of, in 2004 did some qualitative research on the stress and coping of Israeli emergency room social workers following terrorist attacks. And I'm going to read out what, verbatim, a summary of his findings. And he says the most prominent factor in the inability to maintain emotional distance between Israeli social workers and their terrorised clients was the fact that these professionals were integral elements of the attacked community. Not only were their cognitive schemas about safety threatened, their sense of personal safety was endangered as well, and that workers needed to allay their fears and worries about their security of their loved ones before they were able to project themselves into their professional roles. And although they had been trained to respond in emergency situations and were fairly knowledgeable about potential scenarios, they were overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude and swift onslaught of devastating sensory stimulation. And the reason that I'm bringing this in is that in 2009 in Victoria we had horrific bushfires, and that were not, that as I'll be talking about in a moment, that really impacted both therapists and clients in a whole multitude of different ways. There were the floods in Queensland earlier this year. Now, if you're working as a trauma therapist in any of those sort of areas where you may also be at risk, or family or friends are at risk, your capacity to be able to respond may be impacted by your concern for either your own safety or the safety of other people. Then there are socio-cultural issues. When we may be working with people from a different culture, that's also going to require greater demands and different skills from us. And so, again, the way that you may respond to people from another culture and trying to really make sure that you are being culturally sensitive and appropriate is another, I guess, sort of like stress or strain in the therapy situation that you're, again, sort of like monitoring yourself. That can be another factor that impacts our VT. And when you're working with someone who from a different culture, if you throw in the fact that they may also be highly distressed and traumatised, it makes it also a more complex dialogue, potentially fraught with possibilities of misunderstanding and miscommunication. Another thing that we may feel very uncomfortable about acknowledging, but I think is really important for us to think about, is that it can be the case in our communities, at a social level and within ourselves, that there at times can be an element of blaming the victim and thinking about the worthy victim or the unworthy victim. Now, you may remember in just very recent weeks there was a rape trial in Melbourne of an AFL football player, and the defence lawyer made the statement that the young woman was wearing a miniskirt, drinking alcohol and out for a good time. Now, if that's not blaming the victim type statement, and I think it's like those kinds of ideas are really, infused in our culture and in our society, and whether we acknowledge it or not, we can be impacted by those kinds of ideas and beliefs. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie called Shooting Dogs. Has anyone seen that? It's a really good movie. It's well worth getting out on DVD, and it's a true story of one of the genocides in Rwanda that took place at a school. It was actually filmed on location. It's a very moving account of what happened there. And in that movie there is a scene between a young priest who is working at the school and a female TV reporter. And she's talking to him about what they're experiencing every day, what they're seeing. And she says to the young priest that when she was in Kosovo, she cried every day, but that she hadn't shed a tear since she arrived in Rwanda. And the priest makes an assumption that she's maybe sort of like numb with all the trauma that she's seen, and that's why she's really, she's having that kind of response. And he says that to her, and she replies, "No, it's worse than that." She said, "In Kosovo, I looked at the dead women and I thought that they could easily be my mother. But here, it's just another dead African." And I think that it's really important that we are able to look within and see the darkest corners of our own minds, where our own prejudices and guilts may hide, because these hidden things within ourselves are going to profoundly impact our capacity to respond to people in our room, and also to develop a healthy resilience to working with traumatised people. Another factor is around professional supervision and development. Now, there is plenty of training available these days, but funds are all too limited. And often, I think that when we're looking around at training, what we're looking for are skills of how am I actually going to work with a particular client. People want to develop those kind of skills and understanding, and there is, I don't think, enough recognition of the importance of our own self-care and how that actually impacts the way that we're working with people. And as I said before, that's why I was so delighted to accept this invitation, because I think that understanding VT and the impact on our lives and our work is really crucial to working effectively as therapists. And then there are personal issues. As I mentioned before, with Laurie Ann Perlman's research in '93, 60% of the therapists that responded to a survey that she did reported a history of trauma or abuse, and that these therapists were having a more difficult time coping than therapists with no history of trauma or abuse. And she also found that their VT experiences weren't moderated through having resolved their own issues in psychotherapy, and that they generally needed more support for their VT and their counter-transference responses. And then finally, the last factor I want to mention are our current life circumstances. Depending on what is happening to us right, at this given moment in time, is going to also impact our capacity to be with clients, and also our susceptibility and vulnerability to VT. So if you're nursing a sick parent, if you're pregnant, if you've got health issues, if you've lost someone through death or separation, if you're moving interstate, something like that, or your partner loses their job, or you're going through major financial difficulties. These are all other significant factors in people who are experiencing VT and having difficulty in managing their VT. So there's lots of different factors, as we can see, that can contribute to our experience of VT, not just that we're working with people who have experienced horrible traumas and difficult life situations, and that's upsetting it himself. It's a very complex